Even after taking 8 bullets, the lion was still alive. Deep inside the African wilderness, a wounded lion vanished into the rocky hills, and only 3 people dared to follow it: a newly married couple and the hunter Jasim Khan. But none of them knew that within minutes the hunt would turn into a fight for survival. Thus suddenly a terrifying roar exploded from the bushes, freezing everyone in place. Would the lion attack? Would you anyone make it out alive? From the legendary book Shikari by Jasim Khan, this is one of the most intense hunting stories ever told. This memorable incident actually belonged to a honeymoon safari. Although the term honeymoon is quite familiar, the romantic aspect hardly appeared in this adventure. If this expedition had taken place after my own marriage, it could certainly have been called a honeymoon hunt. But the reality is that this memorable journey happened after the wedding of one of my closest friends, Peter. That is why calling it a honeymoon safari seems more appropriate. I first meet in Peter in Tanganyika, where he was widely known as a successful and prosperous businessman. When I traveled there for wildlife expeditions and adventure trips, our friendship began during a local outing one Sunday, and it has remained strong ever since. Peter was a sincere, generous, and well-mannered man. He was also highly skilled in outdoor adventures. His aim was famous, and his collection of rifles and firearms was impressive. Added to these qualities were his personal courage and commanding personality, both of which were admired throughout the region. During the time I was engaged in wilderness expedition, Peter got married. It was said that he had entered the marriage after careful thought and a very long courtship. Many people believe that Peter's business intelligence and practical judgment had played a major role in the match. His wife was not especially remarkable in appearance, but she came from a wealthy family and was the only daughter of a rich father, bringing a considerable fortune with her into the marriage. I would rather not say more about Mrs. Peter because I am only repeating what people commonly said. However, one observation cannot be denied. Marriages in which wealth outweighed beauty often appear surprisingly successful. The entire honeymoon safari was arranged and financed by Peter's father-in-law on a truly grand scale. A famous safari company provided tents, camp equipment, furniture, transportation, cooks, servants, waiters, attendants, butlers, and even a tailor. Compared to all this luxury and expense, Peter possessed little beside his personality, confidence, and charm. He also did not want anyone on the safari whose presence might overshadow him. For this reason, instead of inviting a famous professional hunter, he cleverly invited me to accompany him as an assistant and companion on the expedition. This choice made perfect sense. I was relatively unknown, respectful by nature, raised with Eastern traditions and values, and experienced enough in African wilderness expedition to be useful without threatening his position. Most importantly, I was not a better marksman or a more celebrated adventurer than Peter himself, which ensured that he remained the central figure of the safari while I could still assist him whenever needed. I accepted the invitation gladly, as I had no objection to enjoying such a luxurious expedition at the expense of Peter's wealthy father-in-law. At this point, it may be useful to explain the role of a professional or assistant hunter. The true expedition belongs to the person who organizes and finances it. The professional companion serves as a guide, advisor, protector, and trusted friend during difficult situations. My role on this honeymoon safari was that of an assistant companion rather than a professional leader. Since I was still relatively new to Africa, I could not claim to guide them fully, but I could certainly stand beside them in moments of danger or difficulty and fulfill the duties of friendship. Peter and his wife decided to explore the wilderness and observe wildlife in a special region selected for the purpose. One golden morning, our caravan, consisting of 4 trucks, 2 jeeps, and a Land Rover, set over on a journey of nearly 300 miles. We completed the trip in about 12 hours and reached our campsite after nightfall. The location was a sparse woodland of umbrella-shaped mimosa trees with a stream of crystal clear water flowing through the middle. Our camp was established beside this stream. Mrs. Peter personally supervised the placement of the tents and camp structures. She had her own tent and Peter's tent pitched separately from the others beside the stream. However, once all the tent had been arranged, she realized that their honeymoon tent was too isolated and that in case of an emergency, immediate help from the main camp might not arrive quickly. As a result, the entire camp had to be dismantled and set up again in a different arrangement. This exhaustion process continued until midnight, after which dinner was finally served. By the end of the very first day, I had already begun to feel that this honeymoon safari would turn out to be less of a romantic journey and more of a difficult test of patience and endurance. Because honeymoon trips and lion hunting rarely go well together. The next morning, I woke up at dawn to the cheerful songs of birds. I stepped outside the tent and was amazed by the breathtaking view before me. During the darkness of the night, this place had been unable to reveal its true beauty. But now, under the golden sunlight, it looked magnificent. The spring water sparkled like crystal glass, and fish along with other aquatic creatures could clearly be seen swimming in it. Countless birds, partridges, bustards, and many other wild species were arriving to drink water. Nearby trees were filled with colorful and plain birds of every size, flittering from branch to branch and welcoming the new morning. As far as the eye could see, umbrella-shaped mimosa trees stretched across the landscape, gently swaying in the cool and peaceful breeze. While silently admiring the wisdom behind choosing such a beautiful campsite, I wandered further away from camp until the sound of a single shoot informed me that breakfast was ready. At breakfast, both Peter and Mrs. Peter were waiting for me. Mrs. Peter announced that she was determined to see a lion. She had a little experience with small game and had previously hunted birds and small deer. For this safari, Peter had brought her a fine .240 bore express magazine rifle fitted with a scope. The rifle was excellent for lighter game, though in my opinion it was not suitable for large animals like lions. Still, since Peter himself was leading the expedition, I keep my thoughts to myself. On the first day, we did not encounter any lions and only arranged food supplies from permitted game animals. At one point, Mrs. Peter fired toward a zebra standing about 50 yards from our jeep. The animal escaped unharmed, though another zebra standing further behind near a bush collapsed moments later. Peter praised his wife so afterward that it became difficult not to smile. I, however, become cautious. It seemed that whatever animal she actually aimed at escaped safely, while something else entirely might be affected instead. Keeping a safe distance from such marksmanship seemed the wiser course. Still, newly married husband are famous for admiring everything their wives do. On the third afternoon, we set out again in the jeep and continued roaming through the wilderness. Peter was driving, Mrs. Peters sat beside him, and I rode in the back with our assistants and equipment. After a long drive, we finally spotted a lion standing nearly 300 yards away, calmly watching us. The area around it was open with very little vegetation, so Peter accelerated the jeep toward it. For a few moments, the lion stared curiously at the approaching vehicles. Then, perhaps realizing that this strange machine carried several people, including a lady, it quickly moved away. Peter drove after it, and the distance between us narrowed considerably. Suddenly, a ditch appeared in our path, forcing Peter to brake hard. Miss Peter nearly struck the dashboard, but without losing her excitement, she raised her rifle and fired 5 shots in the direction of the fleeing lion. The bullet struck the ground around the animal, throwing dust into the air, and the lion disappeared even faster into the distance. Perhaps it was the first lion in the wilderness that had retreated so quickly from Mrs. Peters' existence pursuit. Mrs. Peter was thrilled by the excitement of the moment, and we all had to share in her jubilant mood. A moment later, however, she noticed that some of her face powder had rubbed onto the dashboard during the sudden stop. Only then did she realize how abruptly Peter had braked, and she immediately began scolding him. Peter pointed towards the ditch and calmly explained that if he had not stopped the jeep in time, we all might have ended up tumbling into it. Mrs. Peter accepted the explanation, took out her mirror from her makeup box, and spent quite some time fixing her appearance. Meanwhile, I silently thanked heaven that none of the shots had injured the lion. Had the animal been wounded, we might have faced a far more dangerous and unpredictable situation. The next 2 days passed peacefully. Mrs. Peter continued telling stories of her bravery and the lion's cowardice, while Peter and I loyally praised her shooting, especially because it had spared us from dealing with a dangerous injured animal. On the third morning, we once again traveled through forest and open plains, and scanning distant areas through binocular in search of lion. Eventually, we entered a strange region filled with broken rocky formations, large and small cliffs scattered everywhere. It looked as though volcano activity, weather, heat, cold, and heavy rains had shattered an ancient mountain range, leaving these dramatic stone formations behind. As we passed through the rocky terrain, Peter mentioned that about half a mile back, he thought he had seen a lion sitting on one of the rocks. In truth, many of these rocks were almost the same color as lions, and years of weathering had shaped them into form resembling different animals. From a distance, one rock might appear to be an elephant, but upon closer inspection, it would turn out to be nothing more than a stone. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a rock. However, to satisfy Peter's curiosity, I suggested that we return and take another look, as if might actually be a lion. The shape of the rock strongly resembled a lion, and the more carefully one looked at it, the more convincing the illusion became. But when viewed through binocular, it became clear that it was not a rock at all. An actual lion was sitting on a high rocky platform. Lions often enjoy resting on elevated rocks like these while observing movement across the surrounding landscape. This lion too sat proudly on the rock like a scene from an old adventure film. The platform stood nearly 100 feet high. Earlier we had passed by close to it, but the lion had remained so still and motionless. that Peter had mistaken it for stone. Naturally, we decided to observe it more carefully. The shoot would not have been easy because from such a height, only the lion's head and chest were clearly visible. Still, Peter seemed determined to impress his wife. He prepared his double-barrel .500 bore rifle, stepped out of the jeep, and aimed toward the lion's chest. I watched through my binoculars the entire time, though the lion remained perfectly still. Its eyes stayed fixed on Peter, showing a strange mixture of curiosity and uneasiness. A moment later, Peter fired, and the bullet struck the rocks near the lion. Startled, the lion leaped into the air and disappeared behind the rocky ledge. About 100 yards away stood another high rock formation. With considerable effort, we climbed onto it and used binocular to look down into the area below. The lion now lay motionless near the edge of the rocky platform. After some time, we cautiously moved closer to inspect the situation. Soon afterward, Aim congratulated and Mrs. Peter cheerful laughter. The lion was brought down from the rocks, and Mrs. Peter posed of several traditional safari-style photographs. For those unfamiliar with such hunting photographs, the first style usually involved standing beside the animal while holding a rifle in a proud pose. The second style involved sitting beside the animal with the rifle while smiling toward the camera, while the third pose was usually more relaxed and informal. However, experienced hunters always considered it important to ensure that the wild animal was no longer dangerous before taking photographs nearby. After carefully fixing her makeup, Mrs. Peter posed for all these photographs one after another. She spent the rest of the day and evening celebrating happily around the camp, while I sat quietly beside the campfire drinking tea. Wildlife expeditions in Africa differed greatly from traditional hunting customs in the Indian subcontinent. In South Asia, hunters often use platforms, bait, and elaborate preparation, whereas area African safari gently focus more on tracking animals through open landscape and observing them in their natural environment. Night hunting and the use of artificial lights of flashlights were also heavily restricted in many areas of Africa. Most safari groups instead relied on tracking footprints, observing movement platforms, and exploring wilderness areas on foot or by vehicle. Although we spent several evenings searching areas where lions were believed to roam, none appeared where we expected them, and our efforts brought little success. We followed lion tracks on several occasions but never managed to locate them properly. At the same time, as a newly married bride unused to long wilderness walks, Mrs. Peter often became uncomfortable whenever bushes or tall grasses disturbed her appearance or spoiled her makeup. For this reason, one of the attendants always carried her makeup box alongside the safari equipment. Nevertheless, despite all these difficulties, Mrs. Peter continued using her light rifle and made sure her presence was noticed throughout the surrounding wilderness. These events seemed to confirm our entire impressions completely. One morning, some of our trackers informed us about unusual activity in a nearby area. When we arrived there, we immediately noticed a large number of vultures circling overhead, suggesting that the remains of a dead animal were lying somewhere below. We left the jeep at a distance and quietly moved towards the area on foot. About 300 yards ahead lay a large depression filled with bushes. When we reached its edge, we discovered that nearly 100 yards further inside the hollow, 3 lions were gathered around a zebra, while 2 younger lions sat nearby watching the scenes with great curiosity. As usual, many others Scavengers and spectators had also gathered around at different distance, patiently waiting for the lines to move away so they could approach whatever remained. Closest the lines was a group of hyenas standing roughly 25 yards away. They were not only observing the lines but also making their harsh, unpleasant call. Further away stood jackals, a few foxes, and large numbers of vultures sitting on the ground, perched in trees and circling overhead. Among the three lions, one large male sat sideways toward us, his thick mane clearly visible. It was decided that Mrs. Peter would attempt a shoot. Peter and I checked our rifle carefully. Peter then positions his hunting stick beneath Mrs. Peter's rifle to steady it and quietly signal for her to take careful aim. Under such conditions, with a large lion sitting clearly visible only 100 yards away, even a relatively light rifle could have produced an accurate shoot. However, events unfold very differentially. Mrs. Peter fired, and what happened next was so sudden and chaotic that even now I feel the need to pause before describing it. The instant the shots rang out, confusion erupted everywhere. Vultures burned into the air, hyenas scattered in every direction, jackals collided with one another in panic, and birds overhead broke formation and flew wildly across the sky. In the confusion, several animals even crashed into each other. But the most dramatic scene was unfolding directly in front of us. Mrs. Peter had aimed toward the lion's shoulder, but the bullet struck the ground nearby, causing the lion to leap up with a thunderous roar. The sudden noise and panic started the other lions as well, and within moments the two large males confronted each other aggressively. Almost immediately, a fierce struggle broke out between them, while the younger lions quickly retreated to a safer distance. Now it became clear why all the surrounding animals had panicked. Hyenas crashed into one another while running. Jackals darted wildly through the bushes, and birds circled overhead in complete disorder. The confrontations between the two lions continued for nearly 5 minutes, though to us it felt much longer. Despite the fear I feel, the extraordinary nature of the scene gradually overcame that fear. After a few moments, I almost forgot that we were standing close to two extremely dangerous wild animals. It feels more like watching an intense scene in a grand cinema than witnessing reality in the African wilderness. I cannot say exactly how the other feels, but all of us seem caught between fear, fascination, and disbelief. Fortunately, one of us panicked because as someone fired another shot during that chaos, the situation could easily have become far more dangerous. Eventually, the two lions seemed to tire of the confrontation. With deep growls, they separated and slowly moved away in opposite directions. Watching their behavior, I had the impression that they were unfamiliar with gunfire and human hunters. It seemed likely that few, if any, hunting parties had ever entered that region before. Apparently, no one had ever fired at these lions in this region before. In any case, once the animal had moved further away, we carefully examined the area. Among the many blood marks on the ground, we identified the traces connected to Mrs. Peter's shoot. From the color and appearance of the blood, it seems that the bullet had struck near the lion's or grazed the lower part of his body. However, after about 10 steps, the blood trail disappeared. The scratches and minor injuries the two lions received during their fight did not appear serious, and very little blood came from them. Most of the blood belonged to the unfortunate zebra, whose carcass had been badly torn apart during the commotion. Blood from the zebra had smeared onto the lion's paws as well. Further ahead, after nearly 200 steps, we found a few additional drops of blood, which strengthened our suspicious that the lion had at least been affected by the shoot. Even so, those traces soon vanished too. Since the lion had continued walking normally, it appeared that none of its leg or movement related muscles had been seriously harmed. Still, it was moving toward dense grass and thick bushes. We are tracking it would require extreme caution. Tracking a wounded or agitated wild animal is difficult under any circumstances, and the situation becomes even more complicated when one's companions include a newly married bride and her makeup box. After moving only a short distance into the thick vegetation, Mrs. Peter refused to continue further. We therefore returned to an open area where a carpet was spread out. Mrs. Peter sat down and busied herself with a makeup kit while the rest of us drank tea. I suggested that if Mrs. Peter returned to camp, Peter and I could continue following the lion's tracks. However, Mrs. Peter firmly declared that Peter would remain with her and that I should go alone to continue the search. I politely replied that I did not possess enough enthusiasm or foolishness to face such a dangerous animal entirely alone. This led the considerable debate, and eventually it was decided that we would divide into two groups. I would remain on one side by myself while Peter and Mrs. Peter would stand on the other. The plan was simple. Since the lion was believed to be hidden in the bushes, both groups would carefully throw stones into the vegetation from opposite directions. If the lion emerged, whichever side encountered it first would attempt to handle the situation. According to hunting tradition, the credit for a successful hunt usually belongs to the person who shoot first reach the animal. By that rule, the honor already belonged to Mrs. Peter. After tea and a short rest, we once again followed the lion's track. Eventually, we discovered signs leading into a shallow depression filled with bushes. Such a hollow was locally known as a donga. Track clearly showed that the lion had entered the donga, but there was no sign that it had left. I positioned myself on one side with a companion, while Peter, Mrs. Peter, the gun bearers, and even the servant carrying the makeup box took positions on the opposite side. At that moment, a thin and extremely tall African youth carrying a long wooden stick happened to pass by. He asked if he would help by throwing a stone into the bushes, and he reluctantly agreed. Once everyone had taken positions, the others cautiously began tossing a stone into the dense vegetation. Only a few stones had been thrown when suddenly a thunderous roar burst from the bushes, and the lion charged out directly towards the side where the young African helper stood. The moment he heard the roar, the stone dropped from his hand, and he fled so quickly that we never saw him again in that part of Africa. At the same instant, Peter fired two shots from his double-barrel .500 rifle, and I fired twice as well, but the lion disappeared back into the thick cover. This time, Mrs. Peter was unable to fire at all. The lion's sudden roar had completely shaken her nerves. Within movement, the lion vanished once more into the tall grass and bushes. Mrs. Peter's face had turned pale and she was trembling visibly. Peter guided her to a nearby tree, helped her sit down, offered her tea, and tried to calm her with polite conversation. Once she had recovered somewhat, I was called over and the same proposal was repeated. Peter and Mrs. Peter would return while I should continue tracking the lion alone. I had considerable experience tracking wounded and dangerous lions, and among all the unpleasant tasks in the world, this ranked very high on my list. The problem was that if I myself had wounded the lion, I would have considered it my moral duty to continue tracking it. Any responsible hunter would have done the same. But risking one's life alone for an animal wanted by someone else was against my personal principle. If Mrs. Peter was not capable of handling the situation herself, then in my opinion, the responsibility belonged to Peter. At most, I was willing to support and assist him. So I expressed exactly that view, honestly and directly. Unfortunately, Mrs. Peter did not appreciate such straightforward honesty very much. Mrs. Peter became often and in her anger said several unpleasant things to me. Although I did not reply directly, I turned to her husband, Peter, and expressed my feeling that under the present circumstances, it might be better for me to withdraw from the expedition altogether. Poor Peter found himself caught in an upsetting situation. On one side stood his newly married wife, and on the other stood the responsibilities and expectations of the hunt. To his credit, however, he handled the matter with remarkable diplomacy. He calmed his wife's reasons with me, and eventually a compromise was reached. He would escort Mrs. Peter back to camp while I remained in position. Once he returned, we would continue tracking the line together. After they departed, I sat with Mafanika on a slightly elevated spot from where the grassy and bush-covered area where the line had disappeared was clearly visible. I lit a cigarette, instructed Mafanika to stay alert, and allowed my thoughts to wander toward the complicated problems of life, particularly the mysteries of old and new marriages. I had become so absorbed in my thoughts that I failed to notice movement in the grass until Mafanika suddenly whispered, "Bhavana, Simba," pointed ahead. He indicated a line moving quickly across an open patch nearly 200 yards away. Without hesitation, I grabbed the .305 rifle from Mafanika and fired toward the moving animal before even stopping to consider whether it was the same line or another entirely. Fortunately, the bullet struck the ground or passed near the line's hindquarters, causing it to slow briefly before disappearing into the bushes. At that point, I became clear that continuing the pursuit alone would be unwise. So I lit another cigarette and waited for Peter's return. About an hour later, Peter came back, and together we resumed tracking the line. Peter's gun bearer confirmed that the animal I had fired it was mostly likely the same line we had been following earlier. Hearing these, I breathed a little easier. The faint blood chases and disturbed ground guided us for some distance, but eventually only light pause prints remained, leading into increasingly dense bushes. At first, Peter and I walked side by side, but the vegetation soon became so thick that we were forced to move in single file. After several hours of cautiously pushing through the undergrowth, our tracker suddenly signaled for us to stop. Instantly, Peter and I tightened our grip on our rifle and prepared ourselves. The tracker steered fixedly toward a dense bush across a small open patch of ground, no longer than 20 square feet. Peter and I moved quietly to either side of him and fixed our eyes on the same bush. Then, without warning, a deep growl emerged from inside the thicket. I quickly surveyed the surrounding. If the line burst from the bush, only a few feet would separate us from it. The situation was undeniably dangerous. The line continued growling steadily as though reminding us that the next move belonged entirely to him. I had heard lions roar many times before, in zoos, in the wild, and even through recordings, but the sound of a hidden lion growling from inside dense Tanzanian bush at such close range was something entirely different. I feel as though the sound came not from outside, but from somewhere deep inside my own chest. My hand and knees trembled. uncontrollably. A strange wave of fear moved through my body, and a small voice in my mind kept insisting that life would be far more pleasant if I was sitting safely at home watching television instead. Whether those moments lasted seconds or minutes, I cannot really say. Time itself seemed suspended. Finally, I signaled Mafanika to throw a stone into the bushes. He pulled several stones from the torn pocket of his shirt and tossed them carefully toward the thicket. The lions crawling became louder for a moment after the stones landed, but instead of charging, it quietly slipped away through the far side of the bushes. Even today, I cannot say whether the lion feared us more or we feared it. In any case, this was the third time the animal had chosen escape over confrontation. After waiting cautiously for some time, we resumed tracking its footprints and followed them for several more furlongs. Eventually, the lion reached an area filled with broken rocks, formation, and rugged stone ridges, the same region where Peter had once before encountered another lion. The animal climbed onto a long chain of rocky outcrops that resembled a continuous low mountain ridge stretching across the landscape. The lion had climbed nearly a furlong into the rocky ridge before we finally stopped near the base of the cliff and had what could only be described as a war council. Tracking a wounded lion is dangerous under any circumstances, but pursuing one through rocky hills is even more hazardous. In such terrains, the lion usually holds the higher ground. Hidden among the rocks, it can observe every movement below and launch a sudden attack at the moment of its choosing. And when a lion attacks downhill from above, the hunter's chances of survival become painfully small. A lion can only be stopped instantly if a bullet strikes the brain. Shoes to the heart, shoulder, or ribs are certainly fatal eventually, but they often leave the animal enough strength to charge before collapsing. Many hunters have earned injuries or worse during those final seconds. Personally, I have never met anyone who could confidently claim to shoot a charging lion accurately in the heavy even single time. I certainly could not make such a claim myself. After discussing all these risks, Peter and I decided not to climb directly along the same route the lion had taken. About halfway up the slope, the path disappeared into thick bushes, and we were almost certain the wounded lions would be waiting there in ambush. So once again, we divided into two parties. I moved up the right side with Mafanika, while Peter and his gun bearer climbed from the left, each group staying roughly 50 yards away from the lion's original trail. That meant there was nearly 100 yards between Peter and me. Before separating, we made one firm agreement: no matter what happened, neither of us would fight over the other side. In rocky terrain, bullets can ricocheted unpredictably, and a misplaced shoe could be more dangerous than the line itself. As we climbed, however, I became increasingly uneasy. Peter had drifted too close towards my side and had even moved slightly ahead of me. If the lion suddenly emerged from the bushes and I fired, Peter would be directly in the line of danger. I could not call out to warn him because the sound might provoke the lion into attacking immediately. After the time, I carried a .375 magazine rifle, while my heavy .450 double rifle remained with Mafanika. For a brief moment, I considered switching weapons. A heavier rifle is generally better for stopping a close-range charge, but I decided to keep the lighter rifle because it offered faster and more accurate shooting at moving targets. Climbing over jagged rocks under such tension was exhausting work. One could not even look properly at where to place a foot because every thought remained fixed on the possibility of a sudden attack. Loose stones rose beneath our boots, adding even more uneasiness to the climb. We had advanced perhaps 300 yards when Bafanika suddenly froze. I stopped immediately and followed this gaze. About 40 steps above us stood a large boulder. Peter was no more than 20 steps away from it. Behind that rock sat the lion. I could clearly see part of his back, tail, and hindquarters. The tail moved slowly from side to side like that of an irritated cat. It was obvious the animal was waiting for Peter. Meanwhile, Peter remained completely unaware and continued climbing steadily upward with his rifle in both hands. A wave of fear ran through me. One or two more steps and the lion might spring at him without warning. There was only one thing I could do. Since only the lion's hindquarters were visible, I aimed carefully and fired in hope of distracting or frightening the animal before it attacked. The bullet struck somewhere near the rear of the lion, causing it to leap upward with a furious roar instead of remaining hidden in ambush. The lion bounded away uphill at tremendous speed. As expected, Peter instantly realized the danger and fired at the fleeing animal. His shot struck near the lion's rear leg, causing it to stumble briefly before disappearing again behind another rock. Before either Peter or I could fire a second shot, the lion vanished from sight. I quickly took my double rifle from Mafanika and shot for Peter to move back so I would have a clear line of fire. At that very moment, the lion roared again and emerged from behind the rocks, limping and moving in my direction. Its mouth was open, its eyes burned fiercely, and deep growling sounds echoed through the hill. I fired. The bullet struck the lion in the chest area, knocking it backward and stopping its advance. The animal struggled to rise again and crashed wildly through a nearby bush. My second shot hit its shoulder, and this time it collapsed heavily onto the ground. Although the lion no longer posed a threat, its leg still moved weakly for a few moments. To end the animal's suffering quickly, I fired additional shots to ensure it died without prolonged pain. Peter finally reached me, shook my hand warmly, and thanked me sincerely for helping save his life. He spoke with genuine emotion and gratitude, words I still remember even today. The lion required several more shots before it was finally rendered completely harmless. Altogether, it had been struck any 8 bullets and now lay motionless on the ground, covered in blood since the very first shot had been fired by Mrs. Peter. The hunt was officially credited to her according to hunting tradition. In my personal library, I own a book written by a famous bow hunter whose adventures were later adapted into a well-known Hollywood film. The hunter had traveled through Africa, pursuing large game animals using only a bow and arrows. The cover of the book showed him aiming an arrow at the standing lion, while inside there are photographs of elephants, lions, and other wild animals reportedly hunted in that manner. I often found myself wondering how remarkable those stories truly were. This particular lion had absorbed 8 rifle bullets fired from powerful high-velocity rifle with tremendous force behind them, yet it had continued moving and attempting to defend itself for quite some time. That thought made me reflect on how dangerous and demanding traditional bow hunting must have been, especially when dealing with such strong and determined animals. That evening, the camp celebrated. Mrs. Peter was in such high spirits that the unpleasant argument from earlier in the day seemed completely forgotten. The atmosphere became cheerful and relaxed once again, and I do feel as always content and at peace. Even so, one though continued to linger in my mind, human beings are sometimes drawn towards dangerous adventures simply because of the thrill and challenge they offer, even when those experiences carry considerable risk. If this story keeps you on edge, just wait for what's coming next. Because in the world of Shikari, every hunt has a darkest trace and every silence hides a new danger. This was written by Jasim Khan, and we bring you stories that blur the line between fear, survival, and reality. Don't forget, we are now uploading new stories twice every week, so make sure you are subscribed and stay continued for the next unforgettable adventure. The next hunt could begin sooner than you expect, and this time the danger might be even closer.